Hey guys, welcome. I want to introduce you to Cassie Sherman-Marks. She is one of the founders of the Maryland Area Environmentally Conscious Gardening Groups on Facebook. It was created in May of 2019 and already has about 3,000 members. So it is a fast growing group, one that I had come across to learn more about native plants. And so I brought Cassie here today to help us to learn more about it. Hi, Cassie.
Hi, thank you for
Thanks for
having
being
me.
here. Absolutely. So we want to begin at the beginning. We would like to know, what are native plants and why is it important to have native plants as opposed to non-native plants?
So let's start with why it's important because I think that some people want to hear that part before they even bother knowing like what they are specifically. Um, Although in general, what they are is exactly what they sound like: plants that are indigenous to the area where you live. Um, so the reason that planting native plants is important is that they're not doing so well. In light of how humans are using land. Eh, and they support the ecosystems we all live in. So um, this is a statistic that I am pulling off the top of my head, and you can get a more specific, but still even a couple of years old, which is kind of scary because it's probably gotten worse than this since. Statistic from Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy, who's a professor of entomology in Delaware, and who has become a New York Times bestselling author on this subject. Um, Something like 90% of the eastern US that used to be wild habitat not too long ago has been turned into human development, where native plants, wild trees, we're talking just, oak trees, maple trees that used to be here, old forests, have been cut down and paved over and replaced with European turf grass. Your lawn is invasive plants. But what tends to happen when you use up the habitats of any given species with something else that they can't access as habitat, is that the number of species that can be supported by the land that's left goes down in direct proportion to how much of the habitat space you've used up. Except it's even worse when the habitat that's left is really fragmented. So say you've got a wilderness park that's a bit of forest, but it's only a city block. That is not a really resilient habitat for native creatures. So it can't even do as much as it could if it were part of a, I don't know, 100-acre plot of forest, which still isn't even that big. Most of what we've got left is in private hands, is developed. And so we need to start thinking differently about how we manage our own yards, because that's what individuals can control. And that's actually one of the things that I love about native plant gardening too. I think especially for parents these days, I have a 5-year-old, and there have been all of these studies that have been coming out that sound doomsday-ish about especially the climate crisis and what is coming with that. And, maybe not having any life in oceans in the next, 20 years, that kind of thing. It's terrifying. I'm wondering if I, let alone my child, is going to live to natural old age. One of the things that is both important and great about native plant gardening is that if we begin to think of our gardens as spaces that we share with wildlife, and this is really taken off first with like planting milkweed for monarch butterflies, because they're charismatic and we notice that they're going away, right? That's sort of just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many other species that might be a little bit less flashy and flamboyant, but that need similar kinds of support, and that we can't even fully understand the impact of, that are threatened right now because we've taken their habitat away. And if we plant the plants that support them, then they can support the bigger animals and the larger processes in our ecosystems that we can't fully map because they're so complex. We won't figure out what's going on until it's too late. But that we know support human agriculture, support the natural processes that filter out our water, our stormwater, that generally keep human people alive.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about the native plants. They're keeping us going. There was a recent study that somebody posted in our group that showed, for instance, that native bees, honeybees, are also an invasive species. They're European. I don't think that we're going to get rid of them, and I don't necessarily think that we should. And it's not just because I love honey, but there are honey producing bees indigenous to the Caribbean in the Americas, but that's kind of it. Native bees, if they're pollinating blueberries, which are also a native species, so go plant some blueberries, produce much, much better yields than honeybees. It was something like 20% more, and I can find you a link on that. But somebody just posted that recently. Mm-hmm. The bugs that are here can't be replaced. We don't even understand all of the impact. So we have to help them out by thinking not of our yards as places that are just for us, where we don't want bugs to bite our leaves and leave silly, unsightly patterns in them or what have you. We need to think of them as ways that we can prop up these systems that we have irreparably degraded.
Okay. Awesome. So, I mean, that makes sense to me. It definitely resonates with me. So what is the definition of native? Because I understand to some extent, but I don't understand completely. So certainly there are plants that were non-native to the US. I remember from my childhood learning about kudzu, which was brought here in hopes of helping with erosion. Turned out it bred like wildfire and did not help with erosion. So that's my initial introduction to invasive species. So how do you determine if something is native? And is it native to a particular area or is it native to a country?
So plants don't care about political borders.
Right.
And ideally, I mean, for this kind of thing, it would be convenient if we could ignore them too. But because they're what people know, we tend to couch definitions of non-native and native plants in terms of what states they're native to. So there are a few vocabulary words that we use around this. Non-native plants are just plants that aren't from, usually people use it to describe plants that aren't from your country, but some people will say your state. Generally, you wouldn't call, if you are on the Eastern Seaboard, like we are, you wouldn't call a plant that is indigenous to California, but that doesn't make it across the Rockies, a native plant here. So there's some wiggle room though. A lot of websites that sell what they call native plants will sell anything that is from the US or anything that's from North America, and they will call it native and have done with it. That makes their job easier and makes there be more flashy things that they can sell, because people have a long habit and a long tradition of looking for exotic plants. Exotic literally means non-native. Right. And has all kinds of other baggage and connotations with it. So I try to avoid using it these days. But so non-native plants are generally, think of it as not, like I like to think of it as not from your state, not from your region, not from like the states adjacent to yours. You can see why this might matter more to, say, Rhode Island or Delaware than it matters to Texas. Mm-hmm. Some people say non-native if it's not native to their county. Here in Maryland, you've got sort of the coastal plain and the Piedmont and mountainous areas to the west. Okay. So a lot of people like to stick to sort of their geological kind of range. So people on the coastal plain want to plant things that are native to the Maryland coastal plain. And people who are in the Piedmont, I'm literally on the fault line in between. So, but they want to plant things that are more native to central and western Maryland. And it tends to vary a bit from state to state. So finding out what people in your area who've been thinking about this for a while, especially master gardeners, master naturalists, etc., think about this stuff will help you. The other vocabulary word that's really important about dealing with non-native and native plants is invasive. When I first started falling down this rabbit hole, which was between 5 and 10 years ago, although it didn't really become a big thing for me probably until around 19 or about around 2019. I think that people used to use the word invasive in two different ways and get into arguments a lot about misunderstanding the way that people were using the word. Some people use the word invasive plant to mean any plant that's non-native. So they use invasive to mean non-native. Some people use it to describe a plant's habit. So, and what I mean by that is how it grows. When you're talking about a plant's habit, you could mean the shape it grows into. People use that a lot with, say, trees. Like some conifers are kind of rounded on top and some are pointed, like, the stereotypical Christmas tree. And that can be a habit, but it's also things like how it spreads. So something like Joe Pye weed, which is great for pollinators, native plant, blooms in late summer, keeps going into fall, really tall, most varieties of it. But it spreads like the dickens. So it has an invasive habit, even though it's a native plant. Other, a non-native invasive plant might be English ivy. It gets into everything. It escapes cultivation and it grows up trees and strangles them. It does bad things, and it is a non-native invasive species. Increasingly invasive plant is being used not to describe natives who spread and not to describe relatively well-behaved non-native plants, but to describe plants that are both non-native and that tend to escape cultivation and cause havoc. So that is generally what people mean. But if you see people having an argument where it seems like you keep using that word, it does not mean what you think it means.
I love the Princess Bride reference.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. I feel like it's an important cultural touchstone of our times.
Indeed.
But yes, it's not entirely without convoluted history. If your state or your county or a nonprofit that is doing more about it than your state, which is kind of the case in Maryland, we have virtually no controlled invasive species here compared to almost every surrounding state. But we do have the Maryland Invasive Species Council, which is a nonprofit that has a long list of invasive species. And they have aquatic plants, they have terrestrial plants, and they're the best authority that I have found for our state. And it can vary by region, depending on whether your state has special interests who are leaning on people or a lack of funding going into the offices that are classifying and vetting plants to be called invasive species. It just depends.
Okay.
Good reason to find a local community that can help you find your feet where you are.
I have heard about, so where I live, there is the Maryland Environmental Area or something like that. Anyway, it's a large protected area of land, and they welcome volunteers in, and they have weekends where they do eradication of invasive species. So I have heard about that. I haven't yet volunteered with them, but I'm familiar with that. But would like to circle back to what we can do on an individual level with our own gardens, our own piece of land, so to speak, with planting more native plants and perhaps eliminating some non-native slash invasive, right? Maybe
Uh,
invasive, may not be species. Yeah, I understand what you're saying with the terminology can be used a little bit differently. But for me, I think of invasive like what kudzu does. That's
yes.
invasive. Like I don't think anybody would argue whether or not kudzu is invasive. It's invasive. Other stuff, I understand how there could be a little bit of difference there.
It's a shame
So
it has pretty flowers.
I know,
You hear
right?
that a lot. And kudzu
Yes.
actually does. I've seen pictures of them.
Okay.
So
I don't think I've ever seen it flower. So there you go. So, on an individual level, how would someone get started? I love the fact that you mentioned that there are some, well, we talked earlier about landscaping companies specializing in native plants, which I think is a great way. But that would be great if you're looking to completely redo your landscaping. But if you're looking at just starting small, what is a good way to get started?
I think this is actually a good way to get started if you're working with a landscaper too. And at least some of the ones around here you can. I know in part because my sister hired one. Um, and I think however you're doing it, whether you're doing it with your own hands or you're hiring somebody else, try to figure out what's going on in your yard first. Figure out which invasive species are the most problematic near you. And if you have them in your yard, and try to use that to help you prioritize that or just what you've let go to seed in your yard. It matters that it matters to the people who live in the yard too. You want to make it a space where both you and the native species to your area can love spending time. Is it ecologically important that you love spending time in your native plant garden? Yes, insofar as it will keep you maintaining it, keep you loving it, investing time and money and energy into it. And you could certainly have beautiful, even formal gardens that are native plants. But you want to start with one area or one definable goal. I found this out by starting the wrong way, but the goal that you want probably shouldn't be I am going to try to remove every scrap of X the invasive plant that's gotten a foothold almost everywhere in my yard. From the whole yard, I'm going to remove this one plant first. You probably want to start with a region of your yard. For me, last year, there's a garden bed right along the front of my house. I can actually see it from the window beyond my monitor here. And it was covered with Vinca minor, which sadly, also known as periwinkle, has evergreen, like glossy dark green leaves, is a vine, and a popular ground cover has purple, sort of almost bluish purple flowers first thing in the spring.
Very pretty
It's a
flowers.
really bad invasive species. Please do not grow.
I am guilty. I am guilty. I love periwinkle. I do remember planting it in the first house that we owned back in a little wooded area because no grass would grow back there. And I thought that would be a great ground cover. I have since learned that not the best option. So I will look for
Stick it in a
others.
pot and bring it inside, or stick
Right.
it in a pot on a patio and keep an eye on it and make sure it doesn't spread. Like most of those things, don't do it with English ivy. Ooh, English ivy. English ivy was the thing that I tried to eliminate from my entire yard. But I still have Vinca in parts of mine. I probably still have English ivy in parts of mine. I couldn't replace it. What you want to do is make sure that you were taking on a small enough part of your yard so that you could not just remove invasive species, but replace them with natives that will spread out, take up the space, and keep them from coming back, keep them from being replanted or replaced by maybe even a worse invasive species, by birds pooping seeds on your yard, which is a problem for a lot of us, especially sadly if we live near wild areas, because wild areas tend to be overrun these days. I live in the middle of the biggest urban wilderness park on the eastern side of the Mississippi. And it is just completely swamped with English ivy, porcelain berry, Asian bittersweet vine, bush honeysuckle, and a bunch of other things that are making it nigh impossible for native plants to thrive. And they all come and get planted here the second that I pull them up. So replanting is really important. I had a whole hill in back of my house that I think we need to terrace if we're going to properly like divide and conquer, which will be a another adventure. That was covered in English ivy. We pulled it up and it looked great for that year. And I threw some native seeds at it because it's like literally so steep and rocky and pointy that it's very, very hard to even like move around on. But the very next year it was completely covered in porcelain berry, which is not any better. So you want something that is manageable. This bed that goes along the front of my house, that was my project last year, includes a rock garden that's kind of over there. It's probably like 35 feet long and 3 or 4 feet deep for most of it, with bigger areas around the corners of the house. And it used to be covered in Vinca minor. It had some little stowaway English ivy bits in there. It had some invasive winter creeper. It had it had some invasive privet hiding in it. And we took basically everything out. And if you can avoid doing that, if you have some native or even like beloved, non-aggressive, non-native species, do that, because like, you know, leave them there. Don't take everything out. But this was really like just a lost cause zone, from an ecological perspective. A lost cause, or even, you know, actively dangerous zone. And we mulched it so that it would be harder for seeds to get planted, for invasive species. And we planted a bunch of native species. My strategy, which I recommend to people, is to try a bunch of different native plant species and see what sticks. Because, for instance, I can only get one type of milkweed to grow in my yard. One of the reasons that milkweed got eradicated in a widespread way in the US is because farmers hate it, because it tends to spread a lot, especially common milkweed, which is what people see the most. So finding out you can't grow milkweed is kind of like, what is wrong with you, dirt? This is what milkweed does.
Right.
But you might find out that even some things that are really simple for other people to grow just don't like your yard, and that's fine if you don't pull all of your eggs in one basket. The thing to do is, and it's good to have a variety of things anyway to support more wildlife, but you don't want so little of any one thing that, say, if the monarchs find you one year, they eat all of the milkweed that you have, which actually happened to be last year. So I'm planting more this year. And I'm trying different native species of milkweed. We have one person in our garden group who is determined to try every single milkweed species native to the state. She has pleaded with grad students in Ohio. She has bought from shady guys on the internet. I don't know how she does it. It's just amazing to me. And she shares her plants and seeds with other people. Most of the plants that I put into my project bed were through a community that shares plants, our group. So having one of those can also really help you. But defining your goals, like geographically defining them and not getting out of hand, like probably even this space that I picked, which is, I don't know, maybe in the vicinity of 100 square feet, would have been a lot if it were my first native plant rodeo. Defining spaces and not getting too carried away is the best way to start. Because if you get really discouraged, you might walk away, and that doesn't help anyone.
Right. Yes, I think starting small is the best advice for anything that you're taking on, particularly if it's brand new, because there's definitely going to be some learning going on. There's going to be some trial and error, and a fair amount of manual labor when we talk about planting things and ripping things out. So great advice. So you mentioned that there are some plant groups. There are groups that share plants. How would someone I mean, we're talking about Maryland, but people in this group live all over the country.
Mhm.
How would you go about finding a group that does that sort of thing in your area?
So it's important to find one for your area, because from area to area, the plants that you should plant and sort of the conventional wisdom that applies given your probably state's unique geography and geology and ecosystems varies a lot.
Mhm.
Um, but try to find something at the state level and see if there's like further division that's helpful to you from there. There are communities in Maryland that have like towns that are all collectively um, into native plant gardening, and they can share in like their neighborhood garden groups, and that's great, but that's not something that's available to most of us. So if you're starting big, try looking for the Pollinator Friendly Yards group on Facebook,
Ooh.
which is kind of it's not just native plants, but it's largely native plant oriented.
Mhm.
And it's big. And if you post in there, or if you look around and post in there, you can probably find somebody who is also in a more local network of people who have this common goal, and they
Mhm.
can direct you there. The other good place to look is with your state's native plant society. Most states have a native plant society. I know the one in California is really, really good for
Mhm.
gardeners. Most native plant societies are more explicitly into supporting native plant gardeners than the one that we happen to have in Maryland. So I sort of got started by finding the Maryland Native Plant Society's discussion group on Facebook and
Okay.
thinking, this is it, I have arrived. But really, our Native Plant Society, they do some things with gardening, but they're much more focused on finding and talking about native plants in the wild. And they didn't want there to be a lot of discussion of gardening, sort of getting them off that topic and off that track. And that could be really discouraging, because this was around when a boom, for whatever reason, was happening in interest in native plant gardening. So gardeners were arriving in this group by the bucket load every day, and then being told, we don't talk about that here. And I really worry about how many people might have just like walked away and said, fine, the native plant people don't want to talk to me. I guess I'll just, go back to growing pansies. Pansies aren't that invasive. They're fine. I like them a lot. But toughest plant ever to have such a like slur defined by them. But so I think one of the next important things is sometimes you won't find the community where you should be able to find it, or you think you're going to be able to find it. And then you have to find a couple of people in the next best thing and start a new one. At the same time ish that I posted something that said, okay, I feel like we've got a lot of people who are talking about gardening here, and maybe we should make another group. And I thought somebody else would do it to just talk about gardening. And at the same time that I started Maryland area environmentally conscious gardening,
Mhm.
another group that is now called Gardening with Maryland Native Plants formed, just because somebody else who was in that comment thread said, okay, I'll do that. But our goals were slightly different. I think one of the things that is sort of a matter of taste is whether you make your community, or the community that you pick, be focused on being supportive of people wherever they are, and especially like being really geared towards helping newcomers,
Mhm.
um, and not shutting down conversations, but having a conversation about, we don't really talk about this here and this is why. Some people want that, and some people just want anything that's off topic to go out the window because they don't have the time to deal with somebody saying, oh, my Rose of Sharon isn't native. What will I do? But I like my Rose of Sharon. Here's 10 pictures of it. Isn't it beautiful? Some groups will say, it is so beautiful, but have you seen our native hibiscuses here?
Right.
And, you know, is that the most problematic plant because in your yard? Because if you have a bunch of English ivy somewhere, maybe work on that first and start getting used to the idea of replacing it with something. Have you considered these 5 plants that are all just as beautiful and native? And so there are groups that'll be like that, and there are groups that'll be like, this is about a non-native plant. Goodbye. We're deleting this post. Figure out what is right for you, because it probably exists or can exist if you find the people who are most on your wavelength about it and get them to start a different community with you. And there's no such thing as too many. We can all collaborate with each other. And it's about supporting people however they need to be supported, and getting information out. So I think that you can find community starting big and going small. The other place where you might want to start is finding out if you have a native plant specific nursery near you, and talking to the volunteers who work there. In this area around Baltimore and DC, we have 3 nonprofit native plant nurseries. We have many, many more nonprofit or even like county-based or conservation organization sponsored native plant sales that aren't like year-round nurseries. But here we have in Baltimore City, we have Heron Run Nursery, which is an outgrowth of Blue Water, Baltimore. We have Chesapeake Natives, which only has local ecotypes, which are like a coveted thing. They're plants that were found in the wild around here, around the Chesapeake Bay region. So they're better for the environment than getting the same plant from the Midwest, because they have a few genetic differences that we don't even know entirely, and it may be a species by species thing, but they might have more wildlife value here. This is one of the things that kind of gets into the weeds with the weeds that we all grow as native plant gardeners. We also have Earth Sangha, which is in Northern Virginia in Fairfax, Fairfax County. It's in Springfield, I think. And they all do things a little bit differently. I can think of 2 for-profit nurseries that are near here, and a bunch of for-profit landscapers. There is even a Chesapeake related, the word Chesapeake is in the name, like landscaper certification thing that you can make sure that your landscaper does if you want them to be working on native plantings in your yard. And there are also a bunch of counties level programs, and whether things tend to be organized by county or municipality varies from state to state, but there are a bunch of county level programs to say encourage people to have rain gardens, which is often a land of a lot of interlap with native plants, or overlap. So there are a bunch of different structures, businesses, government organizations where you can start talking to volunteers or employees and they can point you in the right direction. State university extension offices almost always, if not always, have master gardener programs too. Those tend to be run or divided up by county. My mother-in-law is waiting to finish her master gardening certification in Anne Arundel County here in Maryland. She just has to get some volunteer hours in helping people with their gardens. She's done all the coursework, but because of the pandemic going on at the time that we are talking right now, she hasn't been able to go out and do that. They can often also help you, but they have to help people with all kinds of gardening and having monoculture lawns, which is not good for the environment. Please don't spray for mosquitoes or hire a lawn service. Do not do it. If you're even listening to this, don't do it. And you can ask me why if you want to, but yeah. They serve many masters and many interests, but they can often point you towards native plants too.
Excellent. So in in people getting started, and again, just to recap, pick a small area,
Yes.
figure out what you have.
Yes.
If it is non-native or invasive or both, you're going to want to pull that out and make sure that you have something to replace back into it. So in the stuff that we pull out, in my area, we have curbside composting. So basically they can pick up they pick up our food scraps and our yard trim and take it to an industrial composting facility. But
that's amazing.
What would, is that something that we should not put the, so what we're pulling out, what do we do with it? Can we put it in that yard trim container, or what else should we do with it?
Find out what happens to stuff that's put in the yard trim container, because if it goes through like an industrial grade composting process, the stuff that goes through that gets really, really hot, because when things are biodegrading, they generate heat. And generally that will kill any weed you put into it. Most places, sadly, do not have access to municipal level compost or even private composting services. There was one, I think, that was starting to maybe look around Baltimore, but I haven't heard about it in a while. And I did try to like send an email to say, please let me know if you come to my area. Right. You can probably like call the municipal compost place and say, you know, will English ivy die? Will garlic mustard die if I put it in this compost? Or should I just burn it, put it in one thing that you can do if you don't have access to that, that people swear by, although I think it would probably work better during the sunnier, warmer times of the year, is put your weeds that can, I don't know, do the Hydra thing and just sprout more heads if you cut one off. Right. Like put them in a black contractor bag or black plastic garbage bag outside in the sun for a couple of weeks, and then put them in with your yard waste, even if it doesn't get composted, because it will be good and dead by then.
Gotcha.
That said, some plants like, oh gosh, I hear this a lot, specifically about garlic mustard. Don't leave it on the ground. I wouldn't do this with English ivy either. Don't put it in your personal compost heap. Okay. It might work to put it in municipal compost, but if you don't have access to that, probably just stick it in a garbage bag and send it to the dump. Okay. Because it is that kind of dangerous and that kind of capable of resurrecting itself. Some of these plants are so resilient in this environment because they're not from here and they don't have species that co-evolved to kind of take them down a peg, that they're dangerous unless you make sure that they, I don't know, are staked through the heart and have their heads cut off.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that sounds great. Let's see. We've covered a lot, and thank you very much for taking the time to be with me this morning. I will put some links down below this video for some of the resources that you've spoken about. And yeah, I'm looking forward to getting started. I do know where I live in Howard County, there is the Robinson Nature Center, which does have a plant sale in the spring. And of course, through your group, which I'll put a link to as well. I know that you have quite a few people who share plants as well as seeds. Oh, there you go. One last question. When is the best time of year to share plants? Like when should people anticipate that happening? Is that a spring activity, a fall activity?
In most parts of the US, and it may lean more towards summer in places that are further north than say I don't know, the Mason-Dixon line is the sort of place that you look to on the East Coast. You don't want to plant as much in summer because it's the harshest time of the year.
Mhm.
And that might actually hold to any sort of climate within the US. And planting in fall and spring is the best thing to do. We tend to share some even in the summer here in Maryland, partly just because I think most people have probably seen the meme based on an Ally Broche drawing. You know, who are we gardeners? What do we want plants? Where are we going to put them? We don't know. So that happens. And certainly garden stores don't stop selling you plants then. So your desires may not calm down. For trading actual plants that have come from somebody else's garden, try for spring and fall. People are probably going to have a better kind of sense of what they have to share in the fall, because not everything makes itself known or makes how much it has spread known in the spring, at least not until later in the spring, because it's still sort of coming up. People should have a good sense of how much they've got in the fall. We actually in our group used to do 1 year, our first year did, and then the pandemic happened, an in-person plant swap. That was great. Like, people brought potluck stuff and sat around for a couple of hours and got to know each other. And if you have an opportunity to do that at some sort of central point for your group, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's way easier to do this if you have a community to support you. Sharing seeds, though, is a good thing to do in the winter. I highly recommend checking out something like a winter sowing Facebook group, or Winter Sown. It looks like Winter's Own. The web address has a lot of information on how to basically, a lot of the times, even take plastic milk jugs, as single-use plasticky as they are. And you can also buy other containers for this. It just tends to be a really good way to reuse if you've got plastic milk jugs to begin with, and plant your native plant seeds in particular outside during the winter. Almost all native plant seeds need to be cold stratified artificially if you're going to start them inside, which basically is sticking them in slightly damp sand or vermiculite or something in a sealed container, usually like a plastic baggie, in the fridge for usually 30 or 60 days. Because native plants weren't born yesterday, and they don't want to come up until they're sure winter has happened. So it's not a matter of putting them out in good growing places and expecting them to just bloom. If they've generally been like inside and warm and dry, they want to be wet and cold and miserable for a little while, and then they'll grow. It's a really actually clever protective mechanism that isn't present in a lot of other seeds you may encounter. Native seeds also like being planted most of the time on top of soil where they need light to germinate. And a lot of them are really, really tiny. So if you bury them even a little bit, or if you put them out right before it rains, off they go. So early in the winter, probably want to be starting by around January, which is not to say that people aren't still doing it now, and it's early March. Is a good time to trade for seeds. And do trade, and don't just trade, share. Getting into this can be really expensive. It can also be really hard to find some of the things that you need. And it's worth supporting, especially nonprofit nurseries and anybody who ventures to specialize in native plants, even as, you know, a for-profit business. The more those things happen, the more this will catch on, and the more people will start doing this. And like, if you look up Homegrown National Park or the pollinator pathway, you'll get more of a sense of why it's important that many people do this for it to really help. I think you want to support those people when you can, but a lot of us are hurting after the pandemic. I know my husband lost his job, and it's been hard for me to work between a mother who there's no way I would put in a group living situation, but who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's last summer. Like, there are pressures on people that there haven't traditionally been. So making this accessible to people who don't have the money to spend a lot on getting started through sharing is a big important thing. And you might be surprised if you're just getting started at how many people are like, you want to help too? You have how many acres? Let me get you all the seeds. Because we're not stingy about gardening, I think, in the native plant community. It's a really nice thing.
Awesome. So, well, Cassie, it's been great chatting with you today. I appreciate your time and all of the information that you've shared.
I'm sorry if I get carried away.
No, this was great. Thank you so much.
All right.